Next, we move on to a story. Well, okay, this is going to be interesting. This is a story that is inspired by news coming out of Israel and the use or the conversation surrounding the use of DNA to infer modern cultural identities. Now, this has the potential to stray into difficult territory because, by some definitions of, for example, anti-Semitism, criticizing the state of Israel is itself anti-Semitic, and in this case we have rabbinic courts making judgments on the use of DNA. So I'm not inclined to go down that path explicitly, but rather if we apply a similar approach to what's being used here to talk about whether or not someone is or not from a group of people, I don't think that, for example, you could use DNA testing to prove that someone is or was historically, culturally Liverpudlian or Geordie, for example. Here in the northeast of England, Geordies are enamoured with, especially those who live near Newcastle, enamoured with the Newcastle United Football Club. Some would say almost to the point of mania, and that belief is not tied to their genes. It is culturally current. But it would be difficult to make absolute statements about whether or not someone supported Sunderland or Newcastle based on their genetic profile. And so this story has implications because it's even been quoted by, in this case, for example, Benjamin Netanyahu himself, as being a way of determining, as it were, true membership to a group of people. And unfortunately, this is something that we're also seeing in other realms. For example, on the far right of the political spectrum, we see people who are white supremacists attempting to use genes in a very similar way. And I can't help but think that this is problematic. Inherently, there are issues with connecting cultural traits and beliefs in particular to one's genetic profile, or the observed genetic profile of people who are no longer alive to speak for themselves. Have we managed to skirt that without being too controversial, do you think?
I don't think we should be afraid of being too controversial about this, because what we're not contesting in any sense is the right of the State of Israel to exist, or the right of people who are Jewish to live in the State of Israel as full citizens and so on.
Or in this instance, just to be explicit, in this instance, the right of, for example, a court within Israel to make a ruling. If you see what I mean.
Absolutely not.
Self-determination. Absolutely,
yeah. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. However, what we are, I think, able to do quite legitimately is put to question some of the ideas that have been put forward by the current Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And the particular case we're talking about, he quoted an excavation at Ascalon, where it has been claimed that a very small sample of skeletons identify through ancient DNA analysis, as having originated in, quotes, Europe.
Yeah.
What Netanyahu did, he said, a new study of DNA recovered, this is a quote from a tweet on the 7th of July 2019. Netanyahu's official Twitter feed said, a new study of DNA recovered from an ancient Philistine site in the Israeli city of Ashkelon confirms what we know from the Bible, that the origin of the Philistines is in southern Europe. Now, what he's doing there, without saying it directly, is undermining the claim of the Palestinians to have a right to land and life in what is now the state of Israel, Palestine, and to state that there is by implication again, that the state of Israel exists by right of continuity from the ancient kingdom of Israel,
and David in particular,
and King David, and so on. As told in the Bible, and there's again the assertion there that the Bible is a historical document. So those things are subject, I think, to legitimate debate.
Yes, I agree. I do agree, and in fact, frankly, anything that's written down should be subject to examination, and even actually within, for example, within Christianity, for example, and I know, within Judaism, there are debates about meaning and this kind of thing.
And people who observe a pagan lifestyle and things like that. I think let's cut away from this particular example at the moment to we live in an age of increasingly identity-based politics. What passport you have, what cultural identity you assert, all these things are becoming increasingly important in certain in certain episodes of political discourse. And just in the UK in the last month, and again, I think we're going to be dealing with it more substantially elsewhere, so I don't want to go into the story too much, but we've had allegations, for example, that a far-right group has been holding pagan rituals, as they were described, and initiation rites at the Wayland Smithy Long Barrow on the Ridgeway.
Yeah.
And
actually, in that instance, it seems that the National Trust, in particular, it's been identified have a problem on various sites where people are doing this, and claiming an ancient lineage that, for example, they invokes a need for protection against perceived outside forces, and this is often tied to, well, actually, what is mentioned here, coming back to Netanyahu's tweets, is mentioned here in the MiddleEastMonitor.com, as people are accusing this of being race science, and they also actually connect this to what we were just talking about. The right wing, extreme right wingers often justify ethno-nationalist policies. So it's all tied up with this, and ultimately what it comes down to, I think the real reason that we are mentioning this is because this is all about how you take genetic tests and genetic profiling and how you interpret that, and specifically how people are encouraged to understand the meaning of particular genetic profiles. There's an awful lot of work, arguably, that needs to be done to clarify actually what it means to have a genetic profile, and also crucially what that doesn't mean, and how actually these things are subject to change due to statistical analysis. The more information you get, the clearer the profile becomes, or actually the more questions are raised. Unfortunately, DNA is kind of like the uranium of our time. There was a time in like the 50s, wasn't there, or thereabouts, when people saw uranium as the cure-all. It would cure your cold. It was great as a toy. You could coat things in it. It was seen as these sorts of materials.
There's the wonderful story about the American farmer in the Midwest who wrote to Los Alamos and said, "Have you got any spare nuclear bombs? I've got a tree stump I can't get rid of."
Exactly, and in a similar way, the key to the genetic code has been unlocked with the things like the Human Genome Project, and in popular understanding, genes now are the answer to everything. They will explain why we get ill in certain ways. They will also offer and unlock methods of treatment, and crucially, they are seen as an irrefutable book and story of precisely where you as an individual came from. When you're talking about species-wide modelling, this is much more complicated, and I can't help but wonder whether stories like this really should be seen as a rallying call within archaeology and also other sciences to have better explanations attached to, especially commercially available genetic testing.
Right. I agree with you that I think we as a group, archaeologists and the scientists that we work with, do need to address these issues. And again, I think, without giving too much away, this is something we might return to in more detail in a future watching brief or in some other format. However, what I don't want to appear to dump on our colleagues who work with ADNA.
No,
because the reason for that, Mark, is that I can remember, for instance, in the in the 90s, early noughties, when I was doing my master's, reading Simon James' book about the origin of Celticism, and his argument that what is now, the Celtic fringes and the idea of.
I think I have it just down there, actually. Anyway.
Oh, right.
Go on.
But the idea that the modern idea of Celt is an 18th century construct. It has no origin. There is no demonstrable archaeology saying what a Celt is.
Yeah.
And I remember again at the time when that book came out, a leading expert in Celtic art accusing James effectively of cultural genocide.
Exactly. And to this day, it's still seen as a controversial. Frankly, one of the most controversial things I've ever said on the YouTube channel, apparently, is questioning the idea of whether or not there is a Celtic gene, for example, or a single Celtic identity, as opposed to there being Iron Age cultures who shared cultural traits, much like T-shirts being worn all across the world today, this kind of thing.
The fact that somebody carries an iPhone doesn't mean that they're either Californian or Chinese where they're made.
Exactly, exactly. But there also, as well, it's also to say that there are some statements that you can make using this sort of stuff. So you can, for example, talk about Celtic art. You can, therefore, also infer that people lived in broadly similar ways. But when people get this, as I say, this sort of modern day uranium answer all idea that genes will tell you precisely something about where you came from, down to the letter. Even though, as we've discussed in previous watching briefs, there are terminologies like this person is British and Irish. What's that? That doesn't mean anything. But it's seen as irrefutable. There's something about the relationship, I guess, between interpretation, conversation, and actual statistical, particularly statistical realities here, that's very messy and very open to abuse, I suppose.
I think one of the problems is that we are very lazy about putting, and sometimes it's done, I think, with the best of intentions. It's to try and make it understandable to particularly a lay audience who maybe aren't experts. That it's far easier to talk about Switzerland, say, than the Alpine region of Western Europe. If you're talking about the origins of a particular person.
Well, also because that means
the idea was that I think when the Amesbury Archer was the DNA of the Amesbury Archer was published, it was he may have grown up in Holland.
Yeah.
Holland didn't exist until the 17th century.
No. Exactly. Well, and also it tends to also run an unfortunate trend of normalising the notion of modern nation states as projected back into the past.
Precisely.
Then also attendant issues and problems. For example, and I'll put a link to it below, a screen grab that I did of a Twitter conversation I got into. Following listening to a radio call-in, where it was taken as fact that people have always been, broadly speaking, in this person's words, racist, along, broadly speaking, the lines that we have racial issues today. So linked with skin colour, linked with Europe versus Africa, for example, linked with other issues as well. Now that is not historically, that doesn't historically stack up. If you look at how people in the past saw each other and described each other, yes, there's always been an otherism, but they didn't share our, or some people's, modern particular biases. And yet, even in public conversations, for example, on radio, it's just taken as, oh, well, actually, yes, you're right, people have always had these issues. There are lots of broad statements that are made, lots of sweeping analogies that are made that don't hold water. And I think ancient DNA is particularly open to being used to prop up fallacious arguments, unfortunately. But as you say, we will return to this, undoubtedly, at some point. But I thought this was a very interesting example of that, especially when you have the leader of a country saying, oh, here's some genes that props up a politically expedient cultural narrative. It's it's really, really important. We don't appear to pick on particularly the Israel-Palestine controversy, because just yesterday I was looking at another piece of research and the press releases around it, which was suggesting we're applying the idea of ancient DNA proving that the
population of what's now Scotland has been broadly stable for the last 1,500 years. There's an identifiable Scottish genetic population, which feeds directly. Now, again, I haven't read about it in detail. It's only a superficial, but it was being presented almost as a sort of a sense of Scottish otherness.
Scottish exceptionalism.
Now that Scottish exceptionalism. Now, it may or may not be valid in terms of the archaeology, but it's the way these things are being currently presented.
Well, and also the fact that actually not that only a year or two before that research, it was shown that actually the picture is much more complicated than one in Scotland, and even actually this research itself, again we'll link to it below, paints a nuanced picture. But people like a single sentence summary or solution to their particular quandary, and DNA doesn't really lend itself to a single sentence.
I think. I mean, the biggest lesson I think I draw from all this, certainly particularly, and it is particularly important in terms of outreach, particularly given the sensitivities of these this particular issue. Ethno-nationalism kills people. Yeah. Ultimately, or can do, in the wrong hands, and so any of us working in the field of archaeology, history, public communication of those disciplines, we have to be aware of the potential dangers. And again, it's another reason we're going to be talking about press releases and so on later. But it's a reason to take control of the way your work's presented. Yeah. And take responsibility. And when you put out a story, make sure there is a one-line summary that's actually accurate, not something that a journalist can make up because it sounds good, it makes good copy.
Yeah, no, I agree.